What if I told you that two men sitting in a room in London over 100 years ago drew lines on a map that are still causing conflicts across the Middle East today? Lines that helped create the borders of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. Lines that many argue laid the foundation for decades of regional instability. This is the story of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, perhaps the most consequential secret treaty you've never heard of. The year was 1916. World War I was raging across Europe, and the mighty Ottoman Empire, which had controlled much of the Middle East for over 400 years, was crumbling. As the war raged on, Britain and France began making plans for what would happen after victory. What they created was a secret agreement that would fundamentally reshape the Middle East. Today, we're going to explore how this agreement came to be, what it actually said, and why its effects are still felt across the region today. By the end of this video, you'll understand one of the most important yet controversial diplomatic agreements in modern history. To understand the Sykes-Picot Agreement, we need to go back to 1915. The Ottoman Empire had just entered World War I on the side of Germany, making it an enemy of Britain and France. For centuries, the Ottomans had controlled vast territories stretching from Turkey down through Syria, Iraq, and the Arabian Peninsula. But by 1915, it was clear the Ottoman Empire was in terminal decline. British and French leaders began asking themselves a crucial question. When the Ottomans inevitably fell, who would control their Middle Eastern territories? The British had already made promises to Arab leaders, encouraging them to revolt against Ottoman rule in exchange for independence. Through a series of letters known as the McMahon-Hussein Correspondence, Britain had seemingly promised Arab independence across much of the region. But Britain and France had their own imperial ambitions. They wanted to secure their strategic and economic interests in this oil-rich region. This is where our story really begins. Enter two men whose names would become forever linked to Middle Eastern history: Mark Sykes, a British diplomat, and François-Georges Picot, his French counterpart. Between November 1915 and January 1916, these two men held a series of secret negotiations. Their goal was simple yet ambitious: divide up the Ottoman Empire's Middle Eastern territories between Britain and France. The negotiations weren't easy. France wanted control over Syria and Lebanon, areas where they had historical, religious, and cultural ties. Britain wanted to secure the route to India and control over Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, with its promising oil reserves. After weeks of bargaining, they reached an agreement on January 3, 1916. But this was just the beginning. They still needed approval from their governments and from Russia, their ally in the war. So what exactly did this secret treaty propose? The agreement divided the Ottoman territories into several zones. France would get direct control over coastal Syria and Lebanon, plus a sphere of influence over the Syrian interior. Britain would control southern Mesopotamia, including the vital port of Basra, and have influence over the rest of Iraq. But here's where it gets interesting and controversial. The agreement also created zones for an independent Arab state, but these areas would be under either British or French influence. Palestine was designated for international administration, though this would later change. Russia, as Britain and France's ally, was promised Constantinople and the Turkish Straits. Italy would later be brought into the agreement and promised parts of southern Turkey. The agreement was officially ratified in May 1916, but it remained completely secret. The Arab leaders fighting against the Ottomans had no idea that their promised independence came with significant strings attached. The secret didn't last forever. In November 1917, something dramatic happened that changed everything. The Russian Bolsheviks, who had just taken power, published the text of the agreement in their newspapers. They wanted to embarrass the Western powers and expose their imperial ambitions. The revelation was explosive. Arab leaders felt betrayed. They had been fighting for independence, only to discover that Britain and France had already carved up their lands between themselves. The British government was embarrassed, and tensions with their Arab allies reached a breaking point. This public exposure came at a particularly sensitive time. Just days before the agreement was published, Britain had issued the Balfour Declaration, promising support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. The combination of these revelations created a complex web of competing promises and claims that would haunt the region for decades. After the Ottoman Empire's defeat in 1918, the victorious powers had to turn their secret agreement into reality. But the world had changed dramatically since 1916. The agreement was modified through various post-war negotiations. France eventually gave up its claims to Palestine and Mosul in exchange for other concessions. The League of Nations mandate system was created, which theoretically prepared territories for eventual independence, but in practice allowed Britain and France to maintain control. The borders drawn during this period created the modern states of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. But these borders often ignored ethnic, religious, and tribal divisions that had existed for centuries. Many historians argue that the arbitrary nature of these borders contributed to long-term instability in the region. Communities were divided, while different groups were forced together within the same borders. The effects of these decisions continue to influence Middle Eastern politics today. More than a century later, the Sykes-Picot Agreement remains controversial. Critics argue that it exemplifies Western colonial attitudes, powerful nations carving up other people's lands without their consent. The agreement has been blamed for contributing to various conflicts across the Middle East. Some point to the artificial nature of the borders it helped create, arguing that they ignored local realities and created unstable states. However, other scholars argue that while the agreement was certainly problematic, it's too simplistic to blame all of the region's current problems on decisions made over 100 years ago. They point out that many factors have shaped the modern Middle East, from the discovery of oil to the Cold War to more recent conflicts. What's undeniable is that the agreement represents a turning point in Middle Eastern history, the moment when the region transitioned from Ottoman rule to the modern state system we know today. The Sykes-Picot Agreement stands as one of history's most consequential secret treaties. Born from the imperial ambitions of World War I, it helped shape the borders and political landscape of the modern Middle East. Whether you see it as a pragmatic wartime agreement or a colonial betrayal, its impact cannot be denied. The borders it helped create, the promises it broke, and the expectations it set in motion continue to influence Middle Eastern politics today. Understanding this agreement helps us grasp why the Middle East looks the way it does on modern maps, and why questions of sovereignty, borders, and self-determination remain so contentious in the region. The story of Sykes-Picot reminds us that the lines on maps aren't just abstract boundaries. They represent real decisions that affect real people for generations to come. What do you think about the Sykes-Picot Agreement? Do you believe it's fair to blame current Middle Eastern conflicts on decisions made over a century ago? Or are the issues more complex than that? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this deep dive into diplomatic history fascinating, make sure to subscribe for more videos exploring the hidden stories that shaped our world. And if you want to learn more about the Middle East, don't miss our video on the fall of the Ottoman Empire, which you can see on the screen right now. Until next time, keep questioning the stories behind the headlines.